I was mocked in court during my divorce, but one question changed everything. The hallway of the courthouse buzzed with the low murmurs of attorneys, plaintiffs, and restless spectators. Eleanor stood near the courtroom door, clutching her purse with both hands, her knuckles pale from the pressure. She had barely slept the night before, the anxiety of what today might bring churning her stomach into knots. The marble floor beneath her heels felt cold and hard, matching the tension in her chest. The divorce proceedings had dragged on for nearly 9 months, but today was supposed to be the final hearing, property division, custody arrangements, and the end of a 15-year marriage to a man she once believed was her partner for life. Her ex-husband, Vincent, entered the room flanked by his attorney, a woman named Gloria Hensley who had a reputation for her ruthless demeanor and cutthroat tactics. Vincent didn't even look her way as he walked past her, adjusting his designer tie and offering a charming smile to someone across the room. Eleanor, in a plain navy blouse and gray slacks, had dressed carefully, wanting to appear composed despite her limited means. She had been living in a one-bedroom rental since the separation, working part-time in a small library after over a decade of being a stay-at-home mother. She'd sacrificed her career to raise their 2 children, trusting that love and loyalty would protect her. Today, she would learn how far that trust would be stretched. As Eleanor stepped into the courtroom and made her way to her seat, she could feel the weight of judgment in every glance cast her way. Vincent's attorney whispered something to him and they both smirked, sharing a private joke at her expense. The bailiff called the room to order and everyone stood as the judge entered, an older man with tired eyes who'd likely heard hundreds of cases like this one. But to Eleanor, this wasn't just another file on a desk, it was her entire life, unraveling in public. Her stomach tightened as she sat down, trying to steady her breathing and ignore the quiet scoffs coming from the other side of the courtroom. Vincent had made sure to hire a high-profile lawyer, and Gloria wasted no time in building a narrative. Your Honor, the petitioner, Mr. Foster, seeks a fair division of assets, custody rights, and above all, protection from a financially irresponsible ex-spouse, she began. Eleanor's attorney, a soft-spoken man named Howard, looked almost intimidated. Eleanor had hired him through a free legal aid program after exhausting most of her savings. Across the room, Vincent reclined in his chair with the casual air of someone who believed he had already won. Eleanor couldn't help but feel small under the scrutiny, like a guest in her own life, now relegated to defending choices that once seemed noble and right. 15 years earlier, Vincent had been different, or at least he had seemed that way. He was warm, attentive, ambitious. Eleanor met him at a university seminar on social psychology, where he spoke with conviction about integrity and leadership. He had dreams of becoming an executive, and she had dreams of becoming a teacher. Their conversations stretched into the night in coffee shops and campus libraries, full of talk about the future, equality, and shared responsibility. When he proposed just 2 years later, she didn't hesitate. He made her feel seen, important, chosen. She didn't yet know that the man she loved was more invested in the appearance of success than its substance. After marriage, Eleanor began working as a teacher's assistant while Vincent climbed the corporate ladder. But after their first child, Maya, was born, they decided together that Eleanor would stay home just until Maya goes to school. That temporary arrangement became permanent when their son Noah was born. Vincent began working longer hours, often traveling, and over time, conversations turned to logistics instead of love. His warmth cooled, his criticism sharpened. She became the invisible machinery that kept the house running, meals prepared, children nurtured, laundry folded. He became a figure of distant authority, admired by neighbors for his career and charisma, but unreachable within the walls of their home. For over a decade, Eleanor gave everything she had to her family. She cooked 3 meals a day, coordinated school pickups, attended every parent-teacher conference, and managed the household down to the hour. When Vincent needed to host colleagues for dinner, Eleanor transformed their dining room into a five-star setting. She even learned to prepare his favorite dishes with the precision of a professional chef. Yet, no matter how much she did, appreciation was scarce. "You don't work, Ellie. The least you can do is keep the house in order," he said once, after finding a pair of his socks mismatched. The words stayed with her, a quiet poison that fed self-doubt over the years. Socially, Vincent began distancing her from gatherings that once included her. "These are business functions," he'd explain. "You wouldn't understand the conversation." He created an image of himself as the successful, polished husband, while Eleanor slowly faded into the background. Even when she tried to re-enter the workforce part-time, he discouraged her. "You think a decade out of the job market makes you employable?" he once scoffed. Eventually, she stopped trying. She told herself it was for the children, for stability, for love. But deep down, she feared that she had given up too much of herself. And now, as the courtroom battle loomed over her, those lost years whispered questions she didn't yet know how to answer. It wasn't just emotional neglect. Vincent had a way of making Eleanor question her own thoughts. He'd dismiss her opinions, interrupt her mid-sentence, correct her in front of others. When she expressed concern over their finances, he accused her of being paranoid. He managed every bill, every account, every investment. "You just focus on the kids," he'd say. But even then, he made sure to point out every mistake: Maya's missed dentist appointment, Noah's forgotten field trip form. If the children fell short in any way, the blame fell on Eleanor. She began to internalize it, apologizing for things that weren't her fault, shrinking in her own home. There were moments, brief and bitter, when Eleanor tried to speak up. Once, after Vincent belittled her in front of friends, she confronted him. "Do you have any idea how that made me feel?" she asked. He stared at her blankly, then replied, "You're too sensitive." The argument ended with her in tears, and him watching television as if nothing happened. Over time, Eleanor stopped arguing. It wasn't worth the emotional cost. She learned to avoid conflict by staying silent. Yet that silence came with a price: a quiet erosion of confidence, a slow suffocation of identity. It would take something seismic, something shattering, for her to finally push back. And that moment was drawing closer than she realized. It happened on a seemingly ordinary Sunday morning. The kids were eating pancakes at the kitchen table, Eleanor pouring juice into their glasses, when Vincent walked in already dressed in his tennis gear. Without acknowledging her, he looked around and muttered, "Is this all you made?" She paused, spatula in hand, and turned toward him. "What do you mean?" "I made your favorite blueberry pancakes." He scoffed, brushing invisible lint from his collar. "You know, for someone who does nothing all day, you'd think breakfast would be ready on time." Maya and Noah froze, their forks midair. Eleanor's heart sank as she watched the kids stare at their father, and then back at her, waiting to see if she would fight back. But she didn't. Not yet. That moment, though, cracked something inside her. After Vincent left for his match, Eleanor sat in the laundry room and cried, not out of sadness, but frustration. She had started to see the man behind the mask. The gentle, idealistic student she fell in love with had been replaced by a man who saw her not as a partner, but as a servant. Worse, he had no idea how much he had changed, or perhaps didn't care. That morning marked a shift. Eleanor began documenting conversations, photographing receipts, taking screenshots of bank statements he carelessly left open. She didn't know what she was building yet, but she had learned to trust that her silence was no longer strength, it was suffocation. Eleanor tried to remember the last time Vincent looked at her with warmth. Not duty. Not expectation. Not irritation. Just genuine affection. But nothing came to mind. Every recent memory felt like a transaction. She cooked, he criticized, she spoke, he corrected, she hoped, he ignored. At night, he fell asleep with his back turned to her, his phone clutched tightly in one hand. More than once she saw a name pop up she didn't recognize, late messages, laughter she wasn't part of, emojis she hadn't used in years. She told herself not to look. But one night, she did. And what she found was worse than betrayal, it was indifference. Messages to another woman, casual and intimate. Dinners. Weekends away. Jokes about his exhausted housewife back home. Eleanor didn't confront him. She couldn't, not yet. Instead, she made a quiet decision. She would not fall apart in front of him. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her shatter. What she once mistook for love was now clearly dependency, hollowed out by years of erosion. The man she married no longer existed. And the woman she used to be, capable, witty, passionate, was buried deep, waiting to breathe again. She owed it to herself, and to her children, to find that woman again. It took her 3 weeks to find the right attorney, someone affordable but sharp. She met Howard through a support group at the community center. He wasn't flashy, but he listened. Really listened. Eleanor handed him her folder filled with photos, notes, spreadsheets. "You've already done half my job for me," he said, surprised. She had spent every evening after the kids fell asleep digging through old tax returns, piecing together financial records, and making copies of every suspicious transaction. She had no illusions that the divorce would be clean. Vincent had more money, more influence, and a ruthless lawyer. But she had something else, the truth. Filing the petition was like lighting a fuse. Vincent exploded. "You'll regret this," he snarled, slamming the door so hard a picture frame fell from the wall. Within days, he had frozen their joint accounts, canceled her car insurance, and told the kids she was trying to ruin their family. Maya cried for days. Noah stopped speaking to her. Eleanor stayed quiet, letting Howard do the talking. Every insult, every intimidation tactic only strengthened her resolve. "He's going to try to make this as ugly as possible," Howard warned her. "He wants to win in court, but more than that, he wants to break you." Eleanor nodded. Let him try. In the courtroom, Gloria opened her arguments with practiced disdain. "Your Honor, my client supported this woman for 15 years. She chose not to work, not to contribute. She now seeks undeserved financial gain from the success he built on his own." Eleanor sat frozen. The phrasing stung, this woman as if she had no name, no identity beyond the shadow of her husband. She glanced at Vincent, who adjusted his cufflinks with a smirk, not once acknowledging her existence. The courtroom was quiet, the air tense with scrutiny. Her children were absent, kept away by Vincent's insistence that it would traumatize them. Howard stood and began to counter, but the damage was done. The judge appeared skeptical. Gloria presented spreadsheets showing Vincent's rising income, Eleanor's lack of employment, and credit card statements under her name, all neatly framed as irresponsibility. What wasn't said, but clearly implied, was that Eleanor had coasted on luxury, contributed nothing, and now wanted a payout. Eleanor clenched her fists beneath the table, nails digging into her palms. She could feel the narrative slipping from her hands. All her years of sacrifice, erased in a single presentation. And yet, even as shame wrapped its cold fingers around her throat, she knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning. Then came the laughter, sharp and cruel. Gloria turned to the judge and added, "She has no income, no assets, and no future. My client requests the court to deny any spousal support on these grounds." The gallery chuckled. Even the stenographer looked uneasy. Eleanor felt the room tilting, the weight of humiliation collapsing onto her shoulders. She could barely breathe. Her face burned, her vision blurred. But she didn't cry. She sat still, spine straight, absorbing every blow. Vincent leaned in and whispered something to his attorney, then chuckled under his breath. Eleanor wanted to disappear. But more than that, she wanted to stand. As the judge asked if she had anything to add, she slowly rose. Her voice trembled at first, but her words were clear. "Are you sure about that?" Gloria tilted her head, confused. Eleanor reached into her folder and pulled out several sealed envelopes. "I'd like to submit new financial disclosures, including documentation of a business I co-founded 8 months ago, and its recent acquisition offer." Howard's eyes widened. The judge motioned for the documents. "What business?" Gloria asked, her voice suddenly less amused. Eleanor finally turned to face her husband. "The one you thought I was too stupid to build." And for the first time in that courtroom, the silence fell in her favor. The courtroom grew quiet, the tension thick. The judge reviewed the documents Eleanor submitted while Vincent's attorney requested a brief recess to verify their authenticity. But it was too late, the ripple had already begun. People in the room whispered as Eleanor remained standing, her expression calm but firm. She had spent nights preparing for this moment, even doubting herself as she compiled every legal page and company ledger. Yet now, the same crowd that had just laughed at her was beginning to reconsider who she really was. Vincent's demeanor shifted. His confident posture became rigid, his jaw clenched as he stared at the documents his lawyer now reviewed with growing concern. "What company is this? When did this happen?" Gloria muttered under her breath. Eleanor answered plainly, 8 months ago. "We developed a reading platform for children with learning difficulties. It launched last quarter and just secured a 7-figure acquisition offer." The court reporter paused, stunned. Even the judge raised an eyebrow. Eleanor sat back down slowly, her composure untouched by the chaos she had just unleashed. Gloria regained her footing, though her voice now carried a forced edge. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The respondent did not disclose this business in earlier filings." Eleanor's lawyer calmly replied, "Because the acquisition only occurred last week, and all necessary updates were filed within the required timeframe." The petitioner's side simply didn't expect she had anything to show. The courtroom held its breath. Vincent turned to Gloria, whispering harshly, frustration blooming on his face. His narrative had just fractured, and no amount of legal strategy could fully glue it back together. In one last attempt to retain control, Gloria pressed further. "And what qualifications does the respondent have to build a company?" Her voice dripped with condescension. Eleanor took a breath and answered, "Years of teaching experience, self-study in educational software development, and the passion of a mother who refused to stay silent." There was no theatricality in her voice. Just truth. Even the judge leaned slightly forward, intrigued. The air in the room had shifted. The woman they had dismissed now stood as someone undeniably capable and dangerously underestimated. As the hearing resumed after a short recess, Eleanor found herself seated in unexpected silence. No more sneering from Gloria. No more smug grins from Vincent. The courtroom seemed to recalibrate around her. She glanced around and noticed even the court officers looked at her differently. What had begun as a day of public humiliation was transforming into a reckoning, one built not on anger, but on quiet resilience. Eleanor hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't fought fire with fire. She simply let the truth speak. While the opposition scrambled, Eleanor closed her eyes briefly and remembered every late night she worked on the business plan, every time she coded through exhaustion, every time she doubted herself but kept going. Her partner in the startup, a close friend named Dana, had often told her, "Don't let them tell your story for you." That phrase echoed in her mind now. For years, Eleanor had allowed Vincent to define her worth. But today, she had reclaimed that narrative in the most public way possible, with dignity and facts. Gloria, clearly rattled, leaned toward the judge and said, "Even if the respondent has created a business, the court should consider the petitioner's years of income support." Eleanor responded immediately, not with anger but clarity. Support? Or control? Her voice didn't rise, but its impact did. The room quieted again. She stood once more, her eyes scanning the courtroom. "Your Honor, for years I handled the household, raised the children, gave up my career. I didn't ask for support, I made sacrifices. And I was made to feel like they were worthless. Are we really measuring value by paycheck alone?" The judge listened carefully. There was something in Eleanor's tone that carried more weight than any legal argument, experience. Hard-earned, quietly endured experience. "I only have one question," she said, turning slightly toward Vincent. "If I was so incapable, so weak, and so dependent, then how did I manage to build something successful without your money, your name, or your help?" Vincent said nothing. For the first time, he looked cornered. Not by fury or insult, but by the undeniable presence of a woman he no longer recognized, and could no longer control. As the next witness was called, everyone expected a neutral party or character testimony. Instead, a woman in her 30s stood and introduced herself as a former assistant at Vincent's company. Her name was Nadia, and her presence shocked even Eleanor. She hadn't expected this. "Your Honor, I worked for Mr. Foster for nearly 4 years. I was let go a few months ago. I've recently submitted a formal complaint and am currently part of an ongoing internal investigation involving financial misconduct." The courtroom reacted audibly. Vincent's face went pale. Nadia continued, "I'm here today because I was asked to deliver documents to Mr. Foster's home during the time of his separation. I witnessed him instructing staff to reroute funds, alter accounting records, and misrepresent company expenses. He bragged that his wife wouldn't understand a thing if she ever looked." She looked at Eleanor then, her eyes steady. But apparently, he was wrong. Gloria stood abruptly, objecting on grounds of relevance, but the judge overruled. "I'll allow it. Continue." Eleanor, stunned but composed, felt a shift she could never have planned. The courtroom had become the very stage where Vincent's own lies would finally confront him and collapse. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Nadia submitted documents to the bailiff. Vincent shifted in his seat, no longer the picture of confidence. He leaned forward, whispering fiercely to Gloria, whose forced composure was now cracking. The judge examined the pages with slow, deliberate eyes. "These are serious allegations," he said firmly. "And if true, they not only impact this divorce proceeding but also raise questions of corporate fraud." Vincent opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His silence now screamed louder than his arrogance ever had. Eleanor remained still, her heart pounding. She hadn't orchestrated this. She didn't even know Nadia had come forward. But somehow, the truth had found its way to light. She glanced at her children's photo in her purse, two faces that gave her strength. She hadn't planned to win like this. Her only goal was to defend her worth, to show that her years of silence were never weakness. But now, in front of strangers and a husband who once called her invisible, she had become the storm that exposed everything he tried to hide. The judge requested a recess to review the new information, giving both legal teams time to process what had just emerged. Outside the courtroom, Vincent exploded at Gloria. "You let this happen. I thought you were prepared." She held up her hand, her voice low and cold. "You didn't tell me about Nadia. You didn't tell me there was anything to hide." Vincent turned away, seething. He had counted on a clean narrative, an incapable ex-wife clinging to his success. But now, the story was fractured beyond repair. Meanwhile, Eleanor stepped into the hallway with Howard. "Did you know she'd be here?" she asked softly. "Not at all," he said. "But sometimes, when one person stands up, others find the courage to follow." Eleanor looked down the corridor, thinking of every time she swallowed her voice, every moment she doubted her own instincts. Now people were listening, not because she shouted, but because she endured. The walls Vincent built around his lies were collapsing, not with fury, but with quiet truth spoken plainly and without fear. When the session resumed, the judge was visibly stern. "Given the new testimony, we'll be reviewing Mr. Foster's financial conduct in greater detail. In the meantime, the court acknowledges the credibility of the respondent's recent financial disclosures." Vincent tried to object, but the judge cut him off. "Mr. Foster, any further outbursts will be noted as contempt." Gloria sat back, no longer defending. Her silence was louder than any cross-examination. She had seen enough. The case had shifted entirely, and not in her favor. Then, from the gallery, another voice spoke up. A middle-aged woman stood hesitantly. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The judge looked surprised but allowed her. "I was Eleanor's neighbor for 6 years. I watched her walk her kids to school every morning, attend every event, and volunteer at the shelter on weekends. She didn't have a title, but she worked harder than anyone I knew." Her voice cracked. "I don't know the law, but I know character. And you'd be wrong to think she was ever the one who lacked value." The gallery fell quiet. Eleanor looked down, tears brimming, not from pain, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being truly seen. Vincent's empire, once so tightly controlled, now unraveled minute by minute. As forensic accountants were called in to begin reviewing his finances, it became clear that the implications extended beyond divorce. Eleanor watched as her husband, once untouchable, once adored in corporate circles, sat silent, cornered by his own deceit. His hands trembled slightly, a twitch she had only seen once before, years ago when his promotion was nearly denied. Only now, there was no promotion. There was only truth. Howard leaned over to Eleanor and whispered, "They're going to open an investigation. Depending on what they find, criminal charges may follow." Eleanor nodded slowly. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. This wasn't about revenge. It was never about watching him fall. It was about proving to herself that she could rise. The courtroom, which had once been a theater for her humiliation, had become the place where she reclaimed her identity, not as a victim, but as a woman who refused to be erased. As the hearing approached its final stages, Maya and Noah were invited to speak privately with the judge, under special provision. Eleanor had been unsure whether they should be involved, but the court had insisted. Hours later, when they returned, Maya looked older somehow, more resolute. She walked over to her mother and hugged her tightly, whispering, "You were always the strong one." Eleanor held her close, overwhelmed by the words she'd waited years to hear. Later, the judge addressed the courtroom. "The children have expressed a strong emotional connection to their mother and confidence in her stability and care." Vincent stiffened. Eleanor lowered her head, closing her eyes. Years of emotional burden lifted in an instant. She had worried that her children might blame her, might see her as weak. But they hadn't. They had seen her struggle. They had seen her rise. And in their own quiet way, they had chosen to stand by her. That was the victory no court could grant, and no opposing counsel could take away. That evening, after returning home from the courthouse, Eleanor sat at her modest kitchen table, surrounded by silence. The children were with her sister for the night, giving her rare space to breathe. She reached for a small wooden box in the drawer, one she hadn't opened in years. Inside was a folded letter, yellowed, creased, written by her mother before she passed. She unfolded it carefully, her fingers trembling. Her mother had always sensed things Eleanor didn't say aloud. The letter began, "My sweet Ellie, if you ever feel like the world has forgotten who you are, remember, you were born brave." As Eleanor read, tears welled in her eyes. The words spoke to everything she had endured, her sacrifices, her silence, her strength. "You may not wear power on your sleeve, but it lives in your bones," the letter said. Her mother had been right. Strength wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was waking up every day to a world that tried to break you, and still showing up with your chin held high. That night, Eleanor placed the letter near her bedside. It wasn't evidence for the court, but it was the evidence her heart had needed. She wasn't just surviving, she was healing. The next morning, back in court, Howard made his final move. With permission from the judge, he presented documents exposing several bank accounts Vincent had failed to disclose. The judge's eyebrows raised as he scanned through the records. It appears Mr. Foster was not only hiding income, but deliberately rerouting it to offshore accounts. Gloria tried to object, but it was clear she had not been informed of these by her own client. Her voice faltered. "We were unaware of these documents." Vincent's face flushed red. His entire strategy, portraying Eleanor as dependent and him as the provider, had crumbled under the weight of his own duplicity. Howard turned toward the judge and said, "If transparency is a measure of credibility, the respondent has been nothing but forthcoming. The same cannot be said for the petitioner." The judge nodded slowly, visibly displeased. Eleanor sat, her hands folded, calm as ever. She didn't need to attack. The truth had done all the talking. Word of the case had started to spread. By the final day, the courtroom was more crowded than ever, young professionals, women in advocacy groups, even students from a nearby law school. Eleanor became the quiet symbol of something much bigger. She hadn't intended to be a voice for others, but her story had touched something universal. When the judge asked for closing remarks, she stood once more. Her voice didn't shake this time. "I didn't come here to win. I came to be heard," she began. "For years, I believed that love meant sacrifice, even when it silenced me. But silence is not peace. And survival is not weakness." She paused, then turned her eyes toward the gallery. "If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you cannot allow someone else to define your value. That's something you carry even when others refuse to see it." The judge nodded, visibly moved. And just like that, the narrative was no longer Vincent's to control. The courtroom, once filled with laughter at her expense, now sat in reverent silence. On the final day of proceedings, the air was thick with anticipation. The judge reviewed the findings carefully before delivering the ruling. Eleanor would retain primary custody of the children. A fair division of assets was ordered, including a portion of Vincent's unreported financial accounts. Additionally, the court recognized the value of Eleanor's intellectual property and income potential, affirming her as a contributor to the marital estate. And finally, a modest but symbolic alimony payment was assigned, not because she needed it, but because he owed it. Vincent didn't look up. His empire had not just been cracked, it had been judged, exposed, and rebalanced. He left the courtroom that day under scrutiny, not just by the law, but by the very people who once admired him. Eleanor, on the other hand, walked out to quiet applause. Strangers nodded in respect. She didn't smile broadly, didn't raise her hands in triumph. She simply walked with grace, holding her purse in one hand and dignity in the other. She had been broken, yes, but she had also been rebuilt. Outside the courthouse, as Eleanor waited for her ride, Gloria approached her. The once indomitable attorney now looked softer, subdued. "I want to say something," she began hesitantly. "I judged you. I thought I knew the story. I was wrong." Eleanor didn't reply right away. She looked at the woman who had, days earlier, laughed at her in open court. It would have been easy to turn away, to relish her discomfort. But Eleanor, true to who she was, simply said, "Most people don't listen until they're forced to." Gloria nodded, her eyes downcast. "I learned more in this trial than I have in years of practicing law." Eleanor stepped closer, her voice calm. "Next time, don't wait for a courtroom to see someone's worth. Some people never get the chance I had." With that, she turned away. There was no need for further exchange. The apology wasn't for closure, it was confirmation. Eleanor didn't just win her freedom. She reclaimed her story. And now, even those who once mocked her were learning from the woman they tried to erase. Weeks passed since the court ruling, but the echoes of the trial lingered in Eleanor's life. The media had picked up snippets of the case, not for the scandal, but for the story of quiet resilience that captivated readers. Eleanor declined interviews. She wasn't interested in becoming a headline. Instead, she focused on settling into her new rhythm. Her startup, now fully acquired, provided her with financial independence she once thought impossible. She bought a small but cozy home with a garden, where the kids could run barefoot and laughter could echo freely. She painted the walls herself, one soft color at a time, reclaiming each corner as her own. Maya helped choose curtains, while Noah picked out bookshelves. It wasn't luxury, it was freedom. And more than that, it was peace. Eleanor planted flowers in the front yard, something she'd always dreamed of doing but never had time for. Now, as she watered the soil each morning, she felt grounded. Not because life was suddenly perfect, but because she had fought to stand where she was, on her own terms. One afternoon, while waiting in line at a local cafe, Eleanor heard a familiar voice behind her. "Ellie? Is that you?" She turned and saw Caroline, her college roommate and one of the few people she had lost touch with over the years. They embraced with genuine warmth. They sat down with their coffee, and soon, laughter and memories flowed freely. Caroline leaned forward, eyes wide. "I saw the article. I couldn't believe what you went through. And then I thought, of course she got through it. You were always the strongest of us." Eleanor smiled, humbled. I didn't feel strong most of the time. Caroline nodded. That's what makes it real. It's not about never falling, it's about not staying down. As they talked, Eleanor shared how the business idea started during late nights when she couldn't sleep, how Dana helped her bring it to life, and how everything changed when she finally believed in her voice. You found your fire, Caroline said with a smile. And this time, no one's going to put it out. Eleanor didn't say anything in response. She just looked out the window, heart full, and knew it was true. Eleanor's life didn't become a fairy tale, but it became hers. She began speaking at women's shelters, sharing not legal advice, but something more important, hope. Her talks were quiet, candid, filled with vulnerability. She spoke about invisibility, exhaustion, and the fear of starting over. But more than that, she spoke about courage, the kind that whispers, not shouts. You don't need to roar to be heard, she'd tell the women. You just need to stop believing that silence is all you deserve. Her children adjusted too. Maya began writing in her journal again. Noah picked up drawing. They laughed more. They cried less. And slowly, the home that once felt like a battlefield began to feel like sanctuary. Eleanor made mistakes. She got overwhelmed. But now, she no longer crumbled under pressure, she adapted. Her strength no longer came from proving herself to others, but from knowing she didn't need to. Life moved forward, not with perfection, but with purpose. And that, to Eleanor, was the greatest gift of all. Months later, Eleanor stood on stage in a conference hall, holding an award for innovative education leadership. Her startup, initially built from scraps and doubts, had transformed into a beacon of change. She looked out at the applauding crowd, educators, entrepreneurs, young mothers with fire in their eyes. She took a breath, leaned into the microphone, and began. This isn't just about business. It's about rebuilding your life from the ashes of what others told you couldn't do. As she stepped off the stage, a familiar face stood near the exit. Vincent. He wasn't there with press or ceremony. Just watching. His once perfect suit hung a little looser now. Their eyes met. He gave a small nod, no words. She didn't flinch. Didn't smile. She simply nodded back, then turned and walked toward her children waiting in the lobby. That small nod, an unspoken acknowledgement of everything lost, and everything gained, was the only closure she would ever need. Later that night, Eleanor sat on her porch, wrapped in a knit blanket, a cup of tea in hand. The stars above blinked quietly, and the wind rustled the leaves with a calm she hadn't known in years. Maya came out and sat beside her. Mom, she said, I think I want to be like you when I grow up. Eleanor turned, surprised. Why? The girl shrugged. Because you're brave. And kind. And you don't let people decide who you are. Eleanor blinked back tears and pulled her daughter close. Then I think you're already more like me than you know. That night, she didn't lie awake thinking about the past, the courtroom, or the man who tried to break her. She didn't need revenge. She didn't even need justice anymore. What she had was something more permanent, peace, dignity, and the quiet triumph of a woman who was once overlooked, but who now stood tall in her own story. Not loud. Not angry. Just free.